So today we're going to talk about being trauma-informed at work, or the appearance of trauma at work. I would venture to say that many of the off behaviors we see at work are trauma-related, but to what extent and what should we do? That's coming up now. And here we are in the HR Hub podcast with me, Andrea Adams. Keep listening to learn about this and anything related to HR. You can also find me on YouTube. So today my guest is Dimple Dhabalia. She is someone who is making a difference in the world. She spent 18 years serving refugees in many different countries, and I think we can all appreciate how grueling and heartbreaking that kind of work would be. And the end result for her was that she burned out. Now, she didn't do the normal thing that maybe the rest of us do, which is take a break and, see our mental health provider. She wrote a book about it called Tell Me My Story. And now she works to normalize mental health in the workplace and also help heal organizational and individual trauma and moral injury in the workplace. Hi, Dimple. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. That's your story and situation really intrigued me. So I'm looking forward to these conversations. And as usual, I just dive right in. So we're going to talk about trauma. I know you're not in HR, but as much from an HR perspective as we can. Can you talk about how you think HR should be considering trauma or watching for it in employees?
Yeah, absolutely. I loved how you just described it at the very beginning of how a lot of the off behaviors we see in our workplaces are probably related to trauma. And that's so true. I often think about, have you seen that picture of it's like a sculpture of two people sitting back to back, and then you see their little inner children on the inside reaching out for each other. Like, I really think that that's what we have in our workplaces is a lot of people, are hurting and trying to get through the day without realizing that that's what's happening. And so I think, we have to first of all understand what trauma is. And so in its simplest form, trauma is any event or experience that affects our ability to cope and function. And so over the years, the research on trauma has really advanced. And so there's been this distinction that's emerged between what we typically think of as trauma, which are considered to be big T traumas, versus little t traumas. And so big T traumas are like the big things, the natural disasters, life-threatening situations. They tend to be the things that create like a line that delineates our lives before and after the event. And the thing with big T traumas is we often have no control in them, right? And that's part of the problem is they're big, they affect us emotionally, and they often are very dysregulating. But it's the little T traumas. So these are ongoing stressors like poverty, chronic abuse, discrimination, race or social-based, harassment, subtle acts of exclusion, which are also known as microaggressions, misogyny. So there's so many of these kinds of things that go on and on every day. And then on top of that, in the workplace, especially, we can add in, subtler forms of harm. So neglect, constantly changing policies within our workplace, inadequate communication, a lack of caring. And so all of these things add up over time and become these little T traumas that we're dealing with every day. And as a result, in every single person, we have what's called a window of tolerance to stress. Mm-hmm. And the width of our window really depends on, things that are happening in our life. And so our window is determined by a lot of different factors, but the wider our window is, the more easily we're able to navigate these kinds of things as they arise. But when our window gets more narrow, it becomes a lot more challenging. And I find that in our workplaces, many of us are walking around with very narrow, if not closed windows, which is often what creates this conflict that we see. And it makes it very difficult for us to then flourish and thrive in our daily lives, which ultimately everything comes down to a business case. And it always, so at the end of the day, all of this impacts the bottom line.
So you've come at this from a different angle. You've come at this whole trauma conversation very personally, but a lot of what I see from an outsider's perspective, I mean, I've probably got trauma somewhere along the line, but from an outsider's perspective, from an HR perspective, we talk about being trauma informed. Do you know what that is? And can you tell me about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to describe it like this, that being trauma informed is about recognizing the humanity of the people in front of us. So, we are whole human beings, and we do not leave a piece of ourselves at the door when we come into work each day. And we have been not just asked, but there's an expectation that we compartmentalize ourselves, so that our work life is separate from our personal life, which is separate from this other life. But the thing is, we are whole people. So the reality is that if something is happening at home that is really impacting me in some way, it's going to spill out in some way in my workplace, whether it's because I snap at somebody or I shut down in a meeting or whatever, I'm distracted, right? And vice versa. If there's stuff happening at work, so whether it's, my manager is micromanaging me to the point where I can't do anything, or I, had this client or case today that was just so, it was so heartbreaking. So whatever it is, sometimes we can't let go of those things, and they bleed into our lives in the other direction. And so it's recognizing that, that we have these whole human beings. And so, and then not only that people are bringing in whatever, aspects of their lives, but being trauma informed means that we're going to acknowledge this and integrate it into how we make decisions on behalf of our workforce. So, oftentimes we're so driven by metrics, and metrics are very important. But metrics are, when they're the sole driving force behind how we're choosing and making decisions about things like workload and other, aspects of the work, that's where it becomes problematic. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking about how every decision we're making is going to impact the people in the workforce. So that's part of being trauma informed. In a lot of, especially mission-driven organizations, we have things where if there's, someone dies in the line of doing the work or whatever it is, we don't acknowledge that as a community and share in that moment together. That can be problematic. So we want to create space for this and actually, create spaces of empathy and support and accountability and a commitment to our staff that, hey, you know what, we are here, we recognize you, we see you, we value you, and here's how we're going to do that. And so being trauma-informed really, it creates this space for human-centered organizations, which in turn, just creates a lot more loyalty within the workforce and a desire to want to be there because you feel like, oh, my employer really cares about me.
For some of my clients, so I'm a consultant. And so for some of my clients, there's so much anxiety just to survive, just to have the business survive, just to ensure that their employees have jobs. How can they take that care around trauma, around the interests of their employees when they are themselves under so much stress? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head. I always say that we can't effectively lead others until we can lead ourselves. And so part of this is we have to cultivate self-awareness around our own, our own traumas, our own reactions. And I don't want to overuse the word trauma necessarily, but the truth is that we have things that have happened in our lives that have shaped the lens through which we see and experience the world. And as a result, we have these patterns of behavior that we engage in on a regular basis. And so we can start to notice, we can create awareness around what's my pattern, what's the pattern I fall into when I'm engaging with my staff, or what's the pattern I fall into when I'm engaging with my partner or my kids or whatever. And so the more that we create awareness around our patterns and our survival reactions. And so, and I talk about how there are 5 survival reactions, and we've all heard of fight or flight. So it's fight, flight, freeze, fix, and fake. And so fight shows up as blame and criticism and judgment and even violence.
Yeah.
And that could be towards ourselves or towards others. And then flight is just wanting to get out of the situation. So we may leave, get up and physically leave the situation, but more often it's about emotional avoidance. So this is where we see a lot of addictions popping up. We see alcoholism, workaholism. This is where we see binge watching hours of television, anything to get me out of this space so I don't have to be here. And this is where we see that it's very difficult to connect with other people. And then Freeze is kind of a paralysis by analysis. We're overthinking everything. We can't make decisions. We can't move forward. Fix is this like if then we start playing these games with ourselves. If I could just be a little more productive, then my organization will actually value me. And we convince ourselves that we have to change ourselves in order for other people to please please other people. And all of this stems from feelings of unworthiness. And then fake is, where we show up not wanting to show any vulnerability. So I'm going to show up, I'm going to have this mask on, I'm going to pretend that I'm good, there's nothing wrong. And this is where we see the roots of perfectionism start to grow. And we start hiding behind this mask of perfectionism, and that's not sustainable. And then we expect that of everyone around us, right? And so we create this space that becomes so toxic. And so these are all nervous system responses. And so the more that we can start to notice how these are showing up for us, how they show up in our bodies, because oftentimes when our stress response is activated, it shows up in our body before our mind has a chance to catch up. And so we start to notice these patterns. And then we start to bring in self-compassion, because we are human. We are going to make mistakes. We are going to treat people badly. But can we own those mistakes, and can we forgive ourselves so that we can do better in the future? And the more that we can bring this self-awareness and the self-compassion together, the easier it becomes to start to self-regulate our nervous system in real time. And honestly, that's all it is. If we could all learn to regulate our nervous systems, our workplaces would be so much happier. And that's what we want to do as a trauma-informed organization, is help people learn to do that in real time so that we can not just react, but actually respond with intention.
Hey, business owners, executive directors, are people stresses or challenges getting in your way? Imagine managing your people issues smoothly, addressing, better yet, dealing with employee problems before they're ever a big problem, adapting to all the changes in employee rules, and doing all of this easily. I can deal with your HR challenges so they're resolved. With me, you'll get the right things done, build a strong team, and create a workplace where the right people want to be. Your business deserves to thrive without a lot of HR hassle. I'm here to help you make that happen. With my assistance, you can focus on business growth, supported by a strong team. Take a first step towards a better business today. Reach out and let's chat. Visit thehrhub.ca and let's begin transforming your people challenges.
Okay, can you go over the very basics of self-regulation? I have heard about it, but you're probably the first person on my show to bring it up, actually. Like, what is that?
Yeah. So, we know that we have our nervous system, and the nervous system is divided into two parts. So we've got the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system, I like to think about as the body's gas pedal, right? So this is the part of our nervous system that's activated when when our brain tells us like, hey, we are in trouble. And so this is the part that activates that fight or flight, or any of the other reactions I talked about. And there's a purpose for this, right? It was created to help us get out of danger when we are in danger. The problem is that our brain does not understand the difference between harm to our physical body versus perceived harms or harms to our identity and ego. And in our culture today, because of the way that we work, more often than not, our brain is picking up on threats to our identity and ego. And so, that looks like, that vague email that you get from your boss saying, hey, can you come see me? Your brain automatically jumps to, oh my gosh, I did something wrong. I don't know what's going to happen. And it sends our body into, it activates that stress response. And what happens is that every time our stress response gets activated, we have all these stress hormones coursing through the body. So cortisol and adrenaline and epinephrine. And again, these hormones are meant to help our bodies have the energy they need to actually fight or flee because they think we're in danger. The problem is our stress response is on almost all the time now because of the world that we live in, and it was not designed to be. And so all those stress hormones are causing a lot of the chronic diseases and things that we see popping up for people. And so that's one side of it. And then the other side is the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's the body's brake pedal. And so we want to activate that as often as we can, because that is what helps us get into this state of rest and digest. And it allows us to kind of come back down. So when when our sympathetic nervous system has been activated, again, we're in that pure survival reaction mode. We do not want to be responding to people from that place because it's not good. So we want to get to a place where we can actually engage in critical thinking again. And this is where the parasympathetic nervous system comes in. And so there's something called the vagus nerve, which is kind of like a toggle switch in the body. And so we want to activate our vagus nerve so it'll activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And the easiest way to do that, I know this is going to sound crazy, but it's through the breath. And so we want to breathe deep from the depths of our belly all the way up. And just 3 deep breaths like that can help to kind of shift things back over so we can calm ourselves and get back into that space where we can actually make an informed choice and tap into agency rather than just reacting in the moment.
And I find myself deep breathing just as you suggested. How do you teach this? Like, how do we become more trauma aware and take action as an organization?
As an organization, I think it's all about creating as much agency as we can for people to tap into. And so education, right? We want to create a common vocabulary of terms that are, there's a lot of occupational traumas in different mission-driven spaces. So in my organization, for example, vicarious trauma was a big issue. Vicarious trauma is where you are exposed to other people's trauma, and as a result, you start experiencing symptoms of that trauma as though you experienced it firsthand. And so the more that we can actually name the issues that are common in our workplace and start talking about them and giving voice to them, we start to normalize that. And this helps to remove some of the shame and stigma. And it also creates that common vocabulary. So we're all saying the same thing without judgment, without shame attached to it. And then listening and acknowledging, showing empathy. A lot of times when I work with leaders, people are like, I don't have time to have these long conversations.
Yeah.
But the thing with empathy is empathy does not have to be anything extraordinary. Empathy is presence. It's giving your presence to someone just for a couple of minutes to allow them to feel seen, heard, and valued. And then create transparency around available support. So again, when we are in these spaces of crisis and trauma, it can feel very isolating and also very shame-inducing, especially if we're in an organization that isn't talking about these things. And so we're not likely to ask for help. And so the more that we are, again, talking about these things as an organization, putting up, posters of like, here's where you can get your resources, or here's where you can get help, bringing in people to do workshops, things like that. The more that people understand what's available to them and how to access it, the more that they're going to take advantage of those things and not feel ashamed of it. And hopefully then in the long term, it's going to benefit them and the organization as a whole.
In HR, we have to do things like investigations, discipline. How do you do those things? I mean, those things themselves are trauma-inducing, right? I don't know. Any thoughts about how we can do our jobs and yet be mindful of trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, they create trauma because we create trauma, but they don't have to. And so, for example, I'm actually working with a client right now where we just did an investigation. And part of this is, again, how we're approaching it. So I always approach all these kinds of things through the lens of creating brave space. And so brave space is different from safe space because brave space acknowledges that, first of all, especially for people of color or in other kind of marginalized groups, there's not always such a thing as safe space. And so brave space acknowledges our humanity. And it says, hey, you know what? I am not perfect. I'm probably going to make mistakes as we go through this process, but I commit to owning my mistakes and acknowledging if I say something or do something wrong. And so that's the first piece of it. And then also, we often think that when we're doing these things that, it's all on me, like I have to do this thing, but these are two-way conversations. And so the more that we can actually lean into curiosity is one of the most underrated tools we have in our leadership toolbox. And the more that we can actually get curious about, well, why is this person behaving this way, and help the other person understand, like, hey, this is a conversation between us because I want to understand. And so the more we can get curious, as soon as we employ genuine curiosity, we let go of judgment because we just want to know, like, what is actually going on here. And then we want to, again, create agency. And so in part of creating brave space is asking the person what they need to feel like they can show up fully, and, say what they need to say. And so a lot of this, it depends on how much, how psychologically safe your workplace is. And psychological safety is one of those things that, it's where people feel like they can actually say what they need to say without fear of retaliation or getting in trouble or anything like that. And that doesn't just happen. So trust and psychological safety are things that are built over time. And so if you have those in your organization, then these conversations, whether it's giving feedback or whether it's doing investigations or terminations, they don't have to be traumatizing, but they can actually be something that you work with the other person to create that space together.
That would be easier in some cases than others. I just think about some that I've been involved in, and well, yeah, the employee's so angry. But I suppose if you had a psychologically safe workplace, perhaps they wouldn't come that way. There would have been things you'd done years ago that would have created a different outcome. Okay, we're getting to the end of this. If someone wants to become more, I don't know about trauma-informed, but trauma-aware, more thoughtful around this, what would you suggest?
There is a lot of resources out there now. I mean, you could just Google trauma-informed.
Yeah, you could totally do that. What do you though? Where do you go?
I mean, for me, so, I have a background in mindful performance. And so mindfulness is a really big piece of this for me. And again, when we're talking about mindfulness, we're not talking about necessarily sitting on a cushion for hours a day meditating, though meditation is a big part of the practice for me because there's a lot of research around how meditation helps to reshape our brains so that we can better navigate crisis and trauma. But mindfulness is really, again, it's dipping into that awareness and that compassion for the regulation. And mindfulness refers to, I describe it, so I teach a course called Mindful Performance Enhancement, Awareness and Knowledge, MPEAK. Mm-hmm. And we talk about in that course how mindfulness is really like, going from a regular TV to high definition or from regular headphones to noise canceling. And so the programming or the music stays the same, but we just have this added level of clarity now. And so that's so I think any kind of mindfulness-based mm-hmm. programs can be really helpful because at the end of the day, all of this comes down to understanding ourselves and our reactions so that we can then go out into the world to be more informed in how we're interacting with others. And so I think that that's one of the best places to start. Mm-hmm. Here's a plug for my book.
Sure.
Tell Me My Story, Challenging the Narrative of Service Before Self. I have a whole framework in there for moving through this process for ourselves from, understanding the stories that have shaped us up through what our surviving stories are, and then how we start to create the awareness and bring in the compassion to ultimately move towards this space of regulation. And so I think resources like that can be really helpful as well.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, and I should add, I also have a new podcast out called Service Without Sacrifice. Mm-hmm. So that's another great resource. I've got some really interesting guests on there talking about a lot of different forms of trauma, and each episode, it's a limited series. Each episode corresponds with one part of the book. And I think a lot of people who listen to your show might actually find that very interesting because we bring in a lot of these topics and talk about how they show up in the workplace and things that we can do to, to maybe approach it from a different angle.
And that might be very interesting to so many of, my not-for-profit clients actually, who do experience trauma in their work or the vicarious trauma you were talking about. Well, thanks, Dimple. That was fascinating and challenging, actually, if I'm totally honest. I think there's so much to it. The things that I'm taking away from that, well, and the main thing really is this idea of regulation, and maybe that's what we should be talking about. Well, more than we do, because I don't think we talk about it at all, actually. However, we have reached the end of this episode. Maybe I'll do a regulation episode at another time. But not for now. We'll catch you next time when I talk with another insightful guest.